As the last speaker, it's my distinct honor to ask you to join me in thanking Brian and Don for putting all this together and hosting us. Certainly, we want to thank Mike Chapman for all the work that he's done as well with our sound and all the other things that have come about. A number of months ago, I was on the telephone with Don Livingston as we were trying to figure out exactly what role I would play and what presentation I would give. And Don, Carey, give me a title. And so, and then he interrupted and said, "Oh, no, I don't need to ask a title from you. It'll have federalism in it somewhere." And true enough, it does. And I have to admit, many months ago when we came up with the title of this presentation, I couldn't quite figure out how I was going to link federalism with all this stuff about music, because I know very little about music. But I do know a little bit about reading lyrics, and I think I can put a few things together with that. In 1953, Willie Mae Thornton, known by her entertainment name Big Mama Thornton, released her only successful single. It contained but a few lines of lyrics that were repeated several times, and the lyrics themselves were not that weighty. "You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. Well, they said you was high class. Well, that was just a lie. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit, and you ain't no friend of mine." The words were hardly the material of epic poetry, but legendary they would become. Thornton sold 500,000 records of the song, and it quickly climbed to the top of the rhythm and blues charts. She peaked early, but her place in the origins of rock and roll music is not forgotten. Born in central Alabama to a Baptist minister, Thornton, like so many Southern musicians, learned to sing and play in Protestant churches. She eventually moved to Houston, Texas, where she was discovered. And Houston at the time was a musical center of the South that is often overshadowed by Memphis, Muscle Shoals, and Nashville. In fact, the song was written and recorded not in the South, but in Los Angeles. Thornton, like many African Americans discovered in the 1950s, faced stiff obstacles in reaching northern and western audiences. She partnered with a Los Angeles-based Greek performer named Johnny Otis. Some of you will remember Johnny Otis, Johnny Otis. Boom, boom, boom. Otis, in fact, passed him off as being black until about a generation ago he came out of the closet and said, "Really, I'm Greek." Otis's Los Angeles-based television program was an entry point for many Southern performers into the national television networks. But Otis believed Thornton had potential, even though he also insisted she needed a song that matched her particular tone and style. And so he tasked two teenage Jewish boys from Los Angeles, Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, to work with Thornton and come up with something special. The three rehearsed, and at the end of 1952, the boys, only 19 years of age, wrote the song Hound Dog to match her vocals. In an interview with Rolling Stone magazine many years later, the writers explained they wanted a song that Thornton could, quote unquote, growl. Lieber and Stoller were on the verge of their own great success. They went on to write some of the most iconic songs of the early rock and roll era, including Stand By Me, Yakety Yak, Charlie Brown, On Broadway. And in 1957, they wrote for Elvis Presley his hit, Jailhouse Rock. Lieber and Stoller were certainly not Southern, and one could argue their success as songwriters had as much to do with their uncanny ability to produce music that captured the singing styles of the Southerners with whom they worked. That's typically how the story goes. On the other hand, it could just as equally be argued that Southerners took the writing style of Lieber and Stoller and made them famous. Such was the case with Elvis Presley, who recorded Hound Dog 3 years after its first release, performed it for a national television audience on the Milton Berle Show in the summer of '56, and eventually sold over 10 million copies. Purportedly, Lieber and Stoller did not receive Elvis's new recording of their song very well. They were happy for its success, but when telling Stoller of the new release, Lieber had to explain that it was not the Big Mama version that was now a hit. Instead, he said, "No, some white guy named Elvis Presley." Again, years later, he added, and I quote, "And I heard the record and I was disappointed. It just sounded terribly nervous, too fast, too white. But you know, after it sold 7 or 8 million records, it started to sound better." So why was Elvis most successful? Nearly a dozen artists had recorded the song Hound Dog between Thornton's version, released in '53, and Elvis's release in '56. Few listened to the other versions. Now, Elvis apparently did. He liked the song and he thought he could do better. But why did he do so much better? Was it a matter of style? His eloquent Mississippi voice? His often celebrated moves on the Milton Berle and then the Ed Sullivan television shows, which, by the way, those moves were similar to the religious gyrations that Elvis had witnessed as a young boy. It's the modern interpreters who say this was an overly sexualized dance that he was performing on those shows, but people in churches were doing that. Now, we've spent a great deal of time explaining how Southerners write their music, much to all of our benefits. And we have learned how their rootedness served as the primary means by which that music was produced. But I think it's equally important to ask the question, why these people were and are so successful. Why would Big Mama Thornton record and sell a song written by 2 Jewish boys from Los Angeles? She sold approximately 500,000 singles. But Elvis Presley, a poor boy from Mississippi, as I said, eventually sold 10 million copies. It's easy to recall that he was merely a white boy singing black music. How many times have we heard this story? But perhaps that position is a little too simplistic. Perhaps there's more. Perhaps there's something about the ability of Elvis Presley, Bill Monroe, Hank Williams Sr. and Jr., Alan Jackson, the Allman Brothers, and countless other Southern musicians to speak to multiple audiences in a way that each group of persons could understand. And most important, perhaps this skill fails to often be inculcated in the children of other American regions. In short, maybe there is some distinctive secret to Southern success that transcends music and contributed to their entrepreneurial and political success since the days of Captain John Smith at colonial Jamestown. And so to understand the nature of this entrepreneurial success, and I could just as easily call it political success, cultural success, military success, religious success, I think it's important to understand the distinctive nature of American social development. And I have covered this development numerous times before, hence Don's admonition that I'll probably have federalism in the title. And so I'm only going to summarize it here. Suffice it to say that as British North Americans settled their colonies, they encountered far more instances of political and religious failures than they ever enjoyed genuine success. The original visions of each group of colonial settlers, whether in Massachusetts or Virginia, the Carolinas or in Pennsylvania, they all met systematic failure. The colonial leadership could never implement their bold visions for New World settlement. Those visions were too abstract, too inflexible, too infused with the religious zeal that was common in the development of early English ideological thinking. Instead of visionary success, time and the necessity of living in the harsh colonial environment forced the colonists to rely upon traditional means of ordering their lives. Ancient family practices, linguistic accents, culinary preferences, traditional religious habits, economic patterns conducive to local geography and climate, and countless other folkways and taboos produced a wide diversity of communities across North America. The presence of the frontier and shifting economic needs made these communities largely voluntary for most of the population. Now, true enough, long-standing traditions transplanted from the Old World still meant that these societies retained much of the hierarchies and the legal foundations that most modern people came to dislike centuries later. But this was not altogether a bad thing, because it meant that colonial North America continued to look a lot more like medieval Britain than modern Britain did, or the revolutionary new regime in France, or post-Napoleonic Germany. Like the medieval world, British North America was radically decentralized as countless associations and parallel societies emerged to stabilize communities and effectively make people's lives worth living. Those things, like inseparable political obligation, which European political theorists thought were inescapable, colonial North Americans only voluntarily performed. Where modern Europeans sought ways to make political power absolute and indivisible, British North Americans came increasingly to see it as a matter of convenience. Politics was just another form of human exchange, like trading tobacco, falling in love, or moving west. Politics was not one's superior priority. Likewise, even religious obligations, which were normally considered superior to all others by believers, came to be filtered through a variety of denominations, worship preferences, and devotional practices. It's not that religious authority was undermined or democratized, Rather, it was simply implemented in multiple different ways. There's a difference between being decentralized and being eroded. In short, colonial America was a world that was genuinely and practically speaking federal. The existence of these countless parallel societies affected all Americans and served as what likely made the United States exceptional in light of other civilized countries, even Great Britain. And what was exceptional about Americans is how Americans organized themselves and how it affected the way they carried out personal and communal exchange with each other. This includes normal economic activity and politics, but it also includes cultural exchange in matters like food, music, literature, and religious sensibilities. To be successful in any form of exchange meant a person needed to work across far-reaching boundaries and lengthy social borders. This only occurs in 17th and 18th century North America. A successful entrepreneur was not a person who invented something special. Instead, success depended on how well a person could move a product, an idea, or a service, like entertainment, across multiple boundaries without threatening the unique existence of each community to which those things moved. Even before Abraham Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address and referred to the United States as a nation dedicated to a proposition, Americans had a difficult time with the federal nature of American society. Many Americans openly rebelled against this world and sought to reorder it. Even before the eve of the American Revolution, New England writers sought to define the principles that defined their people. Numerous people insisted that to be a good British subject and then American citizen required a dedication to a set of virtues and ideas. School books were populated by assignments that taught students specific virtues. If you wanted to be a good American, you needed to master these things. But they were abstract and oftentimes ideologically derived. To say today that America is an idea stands in sharp contrast to this picture of American federalism. It is the dividing line upon which American conservatism is measured. It is part of a long effort, mainly by New Englanders and New Yorkers, to refabricate a common vision of order that rises above, if not wipes away, the countless parallel societies that dot the American landscape. If you see America through the lens of industrial machines, ladies and gentlemen, then it is essential that every machine have its primary energy controlled by just one thing. 19th century America, by the way, this was called the dynamo. I think we have detergent named that. Every machine needed an operator. Every nation needed a controlling idea. Now, against this America as idea perspective stands the South, and to some degree, even the West. For Southern intellectuals, since the early days of colonial settlement, ideas never made people exceptional. What mattered most were the habits of lives. And from these habits emerged connections and relationships that seemed astronomical rather than mechanical. America, in the Southern tradition, is not an idea. It is a constellation. Indeed, it is a series of constellations, overlapping and crossing in strange ways, and often connected by the faintest star. No 1,000 points of shining, beaming light. It's the faintest of stars that holds a constellation together. It is a world of sometime contesting boundaries and competing jurisdictions of human authority. Some are voluntary, and some even today are involuntary. Now, I'd like to take a very quick detour, because it should be added that living in this world shaped the way Americans educated their children, especially in the early 19th century when these societies flourished and grew at a rapid rate. Educating for a world of parallel societies captured the imaginations of early Americans, especially in the South, where liberal arts colleges quickly populated small towns and urban centers. Now, all Americans took readily to liberal arts education, but none surpassed antebellum Southerners in both commitment and enrollment. I've attended quite a few academic seminars over the course of my career related to education, particularly classical education, liberal arts education, the future of higher education. And one of the things that often comes up in these circles, someone who knows a little bit of history is very dangerous. So someone who knows a little bit of history would always pipe up and say, if liberal arts education is so great, why did slaveholders have so many liberal arts colleges in the Old South? Well, that's somewhat true. They did have more. In fact, by the time of the Civil War, more Southerners attended college both per capita and in raw numbers than any other region of the United States, even though the North and the West, especially the North, vastly outpopulated the South. These included, these Southerners included both young men and young women. And while men typically finished their studies by focusing on engineering and the mechanical arts, all college students in the South followed a liberal arts curriculum to some extent. They all had to learn history, politics, literature, and rudimentary mathematics. All learned to write and reason. College leaders in the South fostered similar conversations that might have happened on any college campus in the 19th century. They shared a belief that the liberal arts enhanced a person's mind and soul, shaped his or her way of thinking about the world around them, and contributed to a common heritage and sense of civilization. We see these same conversations in movement conservatism today. All were familiar with the common strain in Western education that the liberal arts facilitated wisdom and the right ordering of mind and the emotions. Yet in the South, it had a very practical context. It trained people to live and work with people of distinct communities. Studying the liberal arts in the Old South did not liberate anyone. Instead, it taught them how to be firmly rooted in their own communities, weigh those priorities so that a person could properly manage his responsibilities and the rewards of life, while still having some affinity for those whose social obligations follow different paths. Education was something very practical, humane, and necessary in a world where managing men mattered more than operating machines. It should come as no surprise, then, that antebellum Southerners excelled in entrepreneurship. That's not exactly what we normally read about. Most business and economic histories of the United States focus on inventions, northern inventors and their inventions. expansion of northern railroad barons, and the rise of northern capitalists and big business. These played an indispensable role, but so too did southern entrepreneurs, who their management of the plantation system and slave labor produced the fuel that fed northern industrialization. Cotton really was king. As James Henry Hammond, governor of South Carolina, explained, but that king never ruled alone. It needed a complex and vast system of courtiers, consisting of southern planters, slaves, farmers, brokers, warehousers, and others who operated at the fringe of the system. It was enhanced with a myriad of cultural and religious institutions that interacted with the Southern economy. This is all to say that Southern success depended upon a variety of factors, including changes implemented in the management of slaves that started with the first rice plantations that commenced operation in the Carolina Low Country, right near here, this very spot. It also included an education system geared toward producing people who could communicate, exchange, and prosper in this diverse world. But there were a few areas, and I may be wrong about this, where Southerners did not necessarily excel, especially prior to the Civil War. A notable exception, it seems to me, to their success, and perhaps we have just lost memory of this, was in the area of entertainment. Now, this is not to say that there were no noteworthy Southern entertainers in the antebellum period, or that entertainment was not important to Southerners. We know it was. Quite to the contrary. But in the one area where Northerners began to really appreciate the South, music, Southerners, especially black Southerners, were prevented from exercising a leading role. The black-faced minstrel players came about precisely because Northern entertainers wished to monopolize their control and role over that form of entertainment. Now, true, Southern slave owners might have frowned upon slaves serving in that role, but how long would that continue, we will never know. It is hypothetically possible that the new entertainment industry, which furnished so many African Americans with opportunities to escape segregation and poverty in the 1950s and 1960s, might have played a similar role in peacefully transitioning away from slavery, had the Civil War not interrupted that development. We will never know. But it's not hard to imagine slave owners making a transition themselves should entertainment money been an incentive. The unique and humane skills Southern entrepreneurs mastered prior to the Civil War may be better understood by applying religious terminology. Living in a federal world amidst associations is different from living in a world run by machines or guided by ideological and religious principles. It reflects a difference between two types of dealing with the world around us. Now, to borrow from Don Livingston, who many years ago started this illustration, one can be either a Trinitarian or a Unitarian. And sure, these terms are more than just religious in nature. I think they actually are rooted, even though they are deeply rooted in religious positions, but there is another application. In the Orthodox Christian view of the Trinity, the Godhead is inherently relational, and each person of the Godhead subordinates his work to the other based on his primary responsibility. The Son sacrifices himself in order to bring glory to the Father. The Holy Spirit submits himself to the work of the Son. The Father restrains even his own love for his Son to allow him to die in order that the larger cosmic plan of salvation may fulfill the Father's love for his people. Within the Godhead, there are boundaries in tasks and stewardship. We'll let that sink in just for a second. Being crafted in God's image means human beings are not special because they're made in God's image. They are special because they are made like the Godhead. They are relational creatures, constantly forging associations and exercising stewardship responsibilities. This is seen in God's first commandment to Adam before the fall. In Genesis 1:28 we read, "And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heaven, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." This is a world of federalism and multiple responsibilities and multiple levels of priority. Now, in the Unitarian position, all is one and thus a reflection of God. God cannot be divided. God's purpose can only be singular, and his attribute of love supersedes any demands for justice or need to bring glory on account of his holiness. In a Unitarian universe, God loves all equally and unconditionally, no matter the level of depravity that may exist in the human soul. Now, applied to human life, earthly distinctions in wealth, emotions, politics, talent, knowledge, and happiness must be eradicated. To be godly means to eliminate divisions in one's life, as well as divisions in society. There are no distinctions within the kingdoms, either between the kingdom of God and man, or even among those parallel communities and kingdoms in which we all inhabit. What works for one must work for all. Politics is spiritual, and the spiritual is political. What is personal is political, and what is political must be personal. Now, this is not something new or even distinctly American, this division between a Trinitarian and Unitarian. I could just as easily use for the terms Trinitarian and Unitarian philosophical terms like Platonic or Aristotelian, or religious terms like Gnostic and Arian on one side, or versus Orthodox and Pauline on the other. I could go to modern politics and use terms such as constitutional monarchy versus monarchical absolutism. The point here is that accepting and thus learning to navigate the complexity of human existence is quite different from attempting to replace that complexity with religious, economic, political, or ideological simplicity. Understanding stewardship responsibilities and the need to prioritize across those responsibilities is the path to prudence and moderation. And in American history, just as important, it's the path to financial success. But on the other hand, reducing the world to a set of virtues, principles, theological precepts, or even deciding to make just one person or thing the sole priority of one's life paves the road to the Unitarian position. And as John Randolph of Roanoke, the great Southern conservative of the 19th century, often warned, always beware of the simplifiers. In fact, in the great unsettled intellectual world of post-Civil War America, at a time when the most self-righteous preoccupations of Northerners was called into question, perhaps the only time, we find the origins of American pragmatism, as intellectuals like Henry James, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Charles Peirce worked to re-simplify American social and political principles. This effort culminated in the political work of Woodrow Wilson and the philosophical work of Herbert Crowley, who insisted that what mattered most in American life was that we worked together for common ends, even if the work we did ended in constant failure or backlash. So results don't matter. What matters is that we're all coming together to try and achieve a common result. I think the word stupid was used earlier, but anyway. Bringing down barriers, not honoring them, became the supreme goal of progressive politics. In fact, to progressives, by the 20th century, genuine, lived culture became nothing more than a series of artifacts, something artificial, something put together to intentionally prop up a social order and power structure, or just something that's no more than accidental combinations of things. It was either cultural folkways and artifacts were designed to maximize the power of one group or person over another, or they were just accidental combinations, not unlike the combinations of proteins and enzymes that formed life in the Darwinian universe. Culture had no deep meaning, had no deep function. It was either accident or force. So for progressives across the 20th century, some things are good not because of their function, but because they just happen to like them. There's nothing inherently good about culture and cultural folkways, or the means by which any particular cultural artifact is created for progressives. What matters is that the elite likes that thing. And so we sanitize things that we like about the South. It's music, it's food, it's hospitality, and the landscape. But we sanitize and separate those things from what actually created them. Racial tension, heat, humidity, agrarianism, frontier warfare, political self-government, and traditional expressions of Christianity. Can these things really be ignored? Must they be separated? Only the Unitarian mindset insists that how we eat must match our political values, or that the songs we sing must reflect a celebration of the American melting pot. So what is really at stake? It's not just a matter of symbols, or even a matter of the South. What is really at stake is the very means by which we understand our world, our country, and the way we envision human beings sharing their lives. What really makes America unique is how we organize, how we created a country of innumerable parallel societies and fostered incredible economic, political, and cultural success from that world. So for young folks, all of whom are on this side of the room, I say, how might you be successful in this world? How do you cross borders and facilitate interaction and exchange? You need to first educate yourself to understand the roots of all those communities in which you are a part. You got to like the old stuff. You must honor the cultural and traditions that undergird each side of the boundaries of these different societies in which you are a part. You've got to know the boundaries and honor them. You need to know boundaries, K-N-O-W, know boundaries. Don't be motivated by no boundaries, N-O. Educate yourself so that you can speak the different languages and dialects. Understand the different forms of music. Determine what makes people laugh. Read the different recipes. Make yourself aware of the borderlands. Scout them out. Learn to live across multiple frontiers. This requires drive, enthusiasm, and it certainly requires a humane education. Something strictly scientific, something strictly mechanical will only teach you to run machines. Take advantage of the failures of ideologues and the ideologically educated, whose simplistic depictions of the world around us are inherently flawed. When they are accurate, they are only accurate by accident, not intention. So take advantage of those failures. Do so quickly. Don't wait. Because elites can no longer count on the facade that everyone else wants to be like them. They know that, and they are working aggressively to change and create a new facade. Learn the lessons of the 2016 presidential election. In the early 21st century, an assumption arose in political circles that new social media technology, like any machine, could be controlled, manipulated, and fits to produce a specific product. In this case, it was producing victory for the Democratic presidential challengers, whose campaign teams prided themselves on being more technologically literate and younger than their rival Republicans. The Obama campaign worked closely with social media marketers, which in 2008 and 2012, social media marketing was still a baby. It was an infant industry. But they worked closely together to identify those people best positioned to influence others in these social networks. How did they choose them? Well, they chose them on the basis that they looked and acted just like the Obama campaign team. They chose people they thought were part of the elites. And so the measure of influence was the degree at which these people agreed with the political and cultural left. Now, that in and of itself was a problem that we did not see until 2016. The Hillary Clinton campaign went one step further and created a massive database of voter information tied to social media, precinct demographics, and a host of other factors. They even named the computer where the database was housed in Brooklyn. Its programmer and operator, Evan Kriegel, was the highest paid member of the Clinton campaign team. And in October of 2016, smelling a landslide victory ahead for the Clintons, Politico described the whole process as, and I quote here, this is incredible, this is middle of October 2016, precise and efficient, meticulous and effective, and yes, at times more mathematical than inspirational. Oh, how those words will live in infamy. These efforts proved so ineffective that when the losing Democrats responded to criticisms of their technology, they claimed there was nothing inherently wrong with the technology itself. Instead, and this occurred in the early days of November 2016, within the first few days following the election. I imagine most of us have forgotten this. Nothing wrong with the technology. Instead, the real problem was that, anybody want to guess?
The people. The truth.
Oh, the Russians hacked the system. This is an important part of the whole Russian hacking narrative. This is the origin of it. But note the real problem here. The real mistake was that the elite ideologically assumed that cultural influencers must, ipso facto, be just like them. And we all ask, what is the path forward? And added to this question must be one that is seldom getting play in America's ongoing culture wars. Where is forgiveness? To provide answers, it helps to determine when did things really start to change for the South. In terms of Southern music, it seems many Southerners are not writing music like what existed in the 1970s or before. And absent in subsequent Southern music, and just as lost in politics, is the virtue of forgiveness. In fact, it's not just in the South, it's all over the United States. In fact, one of the last popular songs on the Billboard charts that emphasized forgiveness was Don Henley's 1989 release of the song, "The Heart of the Matter," a song ironically attached to his album that year, End of the Innocents. It's timely, because in the year 1989 might really have been the end of innocence for the South and the century-old effort of American reconciliation with genuine Southern conservatives. Note that a number of important events transpired in 1989 that we now know had profound consequences. In 1989, January of 89, marked the beginning of the modern gun control movement following a school shooting in Stockton, California. Following that shooting, George H.W. Bush quickly moved to pass gun control fiats by executive order. Ronald H. Brown was elected to chair the Democratic National Committee, the first black man to do so. Brown grew up and worked in Harlem, and he rose in leadership positions in the National Urban League. Under his leadership, the National Democratic Party began to take on a noticeable northern and urban perspective that placed it at odds with its white working class roots. It was Brown who started shifting the Democratic Party toward an anti-Southern position. It was also Brown who helped identify a political candidate who could maintain the identity of Southern and working class people, but most definitely shared the values, the education, and the goals of the rising cultural elite that gained power during the 1990s. It was Brown who identified Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton as the man who would be the next president. Brown, by the way, was made Secretary of Commerce. Some of you are old enough to remember he tragically died in a plane crash in China. Was it Croatia? Croatia. Yeah. It started with a C.
There's a lot of...
Don't. Okay. In 1989, the United States Senate refused to confirm as Secretary of Defense John Tower, arguably the last Southern conservative senator, arguably, and the first Republican senator from Texas since Reconstruction. There were numerous revolutions, sweeping aside communist regimes in Eastern Europe throughout the year. The Tiananmen Square face-off in China occurred in the late spring. The first internet service providers formed in 1989 with talk of a World Wide Web, thanks to a proposal written that year by Tim Berners-Lee, the father of the internet. Emperor Hirohito of Japan and its monarch during World War II died, thus ending the last connection any nation-state had to the darkest war in human history. And while it still remains today, the shadow of that war finally started to lift in 1989. The last Soviet tanks left Afghanistan in 1989. Taylor Swift was born in 1989. I graduated high school in 1989. Francis Fukuyama wrote an important essay at the end of the year entitled "The End of History." He insisted, and all of movement conservatism celebrated him in this, insisted that liberalism was now the global ideology and that all humanity would now conform to its principles. History was over. We had all finally gotten to where we should be going. Ironically, in 1989, the Ayatollah Khomeini died in Iran, which opened the door for Arab families like the bin Ladens to dominate Muslim radicalism. So much for the end of history. Stephen Covey published 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which at one level is the modern man's guide on how not to live in a federal world. But for those of us who insist that the culture wars of the 1990s are nothing but one generation's version of ongoing cultural conflict between New England, the South, and the rest of America, something that had been going on from the very beginning of colonial settlement, 1989 represents an important year. Because in 1989, the culture wars that had dated back to the 1600s came to an abrupt end. And New England was victorious. It momentarily won in ways that no other region of America had ever done. George Herbert Walker Bush was inaugurated President of the United States in 1989. Following the only presidential election in American history when both major parties nominated native New Englanders. George Bush was born in Milton, Massachusetts, and Michael Dukakis was born a few miles away in Brookline, Massachusetts. The Dukakis campaign refused to allow George Wallace to attend the Democratic Convention in 1988. A clear signal that the conservative South, even conservative Southern Democrats, were no longer welcome in the Democratic Party. Team Dukakis no doubt justified this because of Wallace's position on race and civil rights. But it had just as much to do with his populism and his condemnation of America's ruling elite. In Birmingham, they may have still loved the governor, but in 1988 at the Omni in Atlanta, Democrats let their conscience bother them. There would be no forgiveness. No forgiveness for past sins. No forgiveness for opposing the establishment. No forgiveness for opposing all that the elite held holy. Now, momentarily in the 90s, it looked like the South had gained control. There was one point, and I forget what year it was, but you had to go through 7 different people. You had to knock off 7 different people before you got to a person who would be president of the United States who was not from the South. Through the Secession Act, you had Bill Clinton, Al Gore, Newt Gingrich, Strom Thurmond was in that midst. There were several. There was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. He was Southerner. You had to go until you got to the Secretary of State. They were all Southerners. But that was short-lived. You see, in 2004, the parties nominated maybe not native New Englanders, but 2 men who grew up in New England. George W. Bush was born in Connecticut. John Carey was born in Colorado, but he was quickly shipped off to boarding school and was raised in Massachusetts. Ladies and gentlemen, we live today in the most New England version of America in our long 400-year history. The only peaceful way out is to beat them in their failure and maximize our native advantage in navigating the complex world around us. So in conclusion, one song illustrates this basic theme of Southern life, even though it's not really a Southern song, certainly not written by a Southerner or performed by Southerners. The song I mentioned here is The Joker, written by Wisconsin-born Steve Miller, and along with his band, it produced a song that captured the nature of American federalism. At the very least, the Stephen Miller Band is often seen as a part of the Southern rock movement of the 1970s, and please don't debate me on this because I really don't know. They certainly benefited from the popularity of Southern performers and mimicked their sound when they released The Joker in 1973. Not all the lyrics of the song are appropriate for polite company, but the refrain perfectly illustrates the kind of individual Southerners are best able to be. 'Cause I'm a picker, I'm a grinner, I'm a lover, and I'm a sinner, playing my music in the sun. I'm a joker, I'm a smoker, I'm a midnight toker, I get my lovin' on the run. Ooh, 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 ooh. To be a joker at the same time a sinner is not difficult. But to be a father, a son, a Presbyterian, a cotton planter, a manager, a banker, a militia general, a Western pioneer, a Democrat, and a storyteller all at once takes real skill. To be one individual but multiple persons who hold membership in countless communities is no easy feat. It takes, for lack of a better word, a lot of personality. As Kenner, Louisiana R&B artist Lloyd Price reminded us in his 1959 hit of that name. But I think The Joker says it best. There are a lot of sinners in this world, but as we have learned from our study of Southern music, those whose culture endures are the pickers and the grinners. Thank you.